On the morning of May 7th, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy's light aircraft carrier, Shōhō, came under a ferocious air assault in the Coral Sea. Over a span of just 23 minutes, US Navy dive bombers and torpedo planes pummeled the small carrier. Shōhō slipped beneath the waves, becoming the first Japanese aircraft carrier sunk in World War II. Explore Shōhō. From her unique design, final moments at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the aftermath of Japan's first carrier loss. Shōhō began her life not as an aircraft carrier at all, but as a submarine support ship. Laid down in 1934 and launched in 1935 under the name Tsurugisaki, she was built as a combined oiler and submarine tender. Japanese naval planners had deliberately designed Tsurugisaki and her sister ship, the future Zuihō, as convertible vessels that could be quickly transformed into light carriers if war broke out. This clever workaround skirted treaty limits. By classifying the ships as auxiliaries, the Imperial Japanese Navy could essentially have undeclared carriers in waiting. As tensions in the Pacific rose, that contingency plan was put into action. In 1940 to 41, Tsurugisaki entered the yard for reconstruction. Her superstructure was stripped off and replaced with a full-length flight deck and hangar, and she was formally renamed Shōhō, meaning Auspicious Phoenix, upon her recommissioning as a carrier. Shōhō was a light aircraft carrier, considerably smaller than Japan's fleet carriers. After conversion, she measured about 674 feet in length and displaced around 11,400 tons. To support flight operations on such a compact hull, Shōhō was built with a flush flight deck without an island superstructure. Below the flight deck lay a single hangar serviced by 2 centerline aircraft elevators. Originally designed to carry roughly 30 aircraft, Shōhō was modestly equipped by carrier standards, but her conversion included substantial changes to propulsion. The ship's original diesel engines were replaced with a pair of geared steam turbines that produced 52,000 shaft horsepower, driving 2 shafts, giving Shōhō a top speed of about 28 knots, just enough to keep up with fleet operations. In terms of protection and firepower, Shōhō was lightly armed. Her primary armament consisted of 8 5-inch Type 89 dual-purpose guns in 4 twin mounts, positioned along the sides of the hull. These guns could engage aircraft or surface targets, but they were of limited use against high-speed dive bombers. For close-in defense, Shōhō was originally fitted with just 4 twin 25mm Type 96 anti-aircraft gun mounts, a relatively sparse anti-aircraft suite. In April 1942, during a brief refit, 4 triple 25mm mounts were added in addition to her twin mounts in an attempt to bolster her defences. Notably, Shōhō had no armour to speak of on her flight deck. She relied on speed and manoeuvring for protection. With her flush deck design and lack of an island, the carrier's silhouette was low and clean. But this also meant the bridge and flight control had to be located below decks, which complicated operations. Overall, Shōhō's design was heavily compromised, born of necessity. A small, second-line carrier created from an auxiliary hull, useful for providing air cover to convoys and invasion forces, but never intended to go toe-to-toe with any large combatant. Shōhō's career would prove very short. After completing the carrier conversion, she was formally commissioned as a carrier on November 30th, 1941, just days before the Pacific War began. Captain Izawa Ishinosuke took command, and Shōhō was assigned to the 4th Carrier Division, alongside her sister Zuihō. In these early weeks, Shōhō was still being outfitted and training her crew. In the opening months of 1942, she was used primarily as an aircraft ferry, shuttling fighters and bombers to forward bases. Departing Japan in February, she delivered assembled and crated Zero fighters to Truk and Rabaul, with her crew assisting in their assembly for local defense. Through March, she continued transport duties, including a delivery of 19 Zeros to Rabaul to strengthen Japanese air cover in New Guinea. Her first brush with combat came in mid-April 1942, when she sortied in response to the Doolittle raid. Joining a cruiser force in the Western Pacific, she briefly searched for the American carriers, but returned to port after the pursuit was abandoned. At the end of April, Shōhō was assigned to Operation MO, Japan's plan to capture Port Moresby. After a short maintenance period in which her anti-aircraft suite was strengthened, she departed for Truk on April 24th. Her embarked air group was under strength, 12 fighters, including several older A5M4 Claudes and 6 B5N2 Kate torpedo bombers, but sufficient for the convoy escort role she was to perform. Joining Rear Admiral Goto's covering force of heavy cruisers, Shōhō provided air patrols during the occupation of Tulagi on May 3rd, withdrawing that evening to shield the main invasion convoy. On May 6th, she was unsuccessfully attacked by high-flying US B-17 bombers, the near misses betraying her position to Allied reconnaissance. By nightfall, she was still on station south of the WWII archipelago, unaware that a major American carrier strike was being prepared for the next morning. The events of May 7th, 1942, would bring her brief career to a violent end. At dawn on May 7th, 1942, both navies launched scout planes into the overcast skies of the Coral Sea, each hunting for the other's carriers. The Americans struck first. Shortly after 7:30 a.m., US reconnaissance spotted Goto's cruiser covering force and the Port Moresby invasion convoy in Shōhō's vicinity. The report was misinterpreted at Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's flagship, leading the Americans to believe they had found the main Japanese carrier force. Seizing the opportunity, Fletcher directed every available strike aircraft to the attack. From the decks of USS Lexington and USS Yorktown, a massive wave of aircraft roared off. In total, 53 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 22 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 18 F-4F Wildcat fighters droned toward the sighting report. Their actual target would be the lone light carrier Shōhō. Mid-morning found Shōhō northeast of Mishima Island, escorting the invasion convoy and zigzagging under cloudy skies. On board the Japanese carrier, lookouts suddenly reported enemy aircraft diving out of the sun just before 11 a.m. Shōhō's combat air patrol at that moment consisted of only 3 fighters, 2 antiquated A5M, 4 Claudes, and 1 A6M0, circling on station. The carrier's radar was non-existent. The IJN relied on visual sighting, so the American strike achieved near-complete surprise. As dive-bombing sirens echoed, Shōhō's few cap fighters rushed to intercept the first wave of Lexington's SBD Dauntless dive bombers just as they peeled over into their dives. Tracers arced upward from the carrier's 5-inch guns and 25mm mounts, but the sheer number of attackers was overwhelming. Despite the chaos, the initial American bomb runs were off the mark. No direct hits were scored in the first minutes, as Shōhō swerved hard and threw up anti-aircraft fire. One Dauntless was shot down by the lone Zero fighter after pulling out of its dive, and a few others were riddled with bullet holes. Sensing the threat, Shōhō's captain, Izawa, urgently launched 3 more Zero fighters from the deck to reinforce the cap as the next wave of attackers bore in. At 11:18 a.m., a second group of SBD dive bombers, part of Lexington's coordinated strike, dove through the clouds. This time, Shōhō could not evade them. Amidst the thunderous bursts of flak and plumes of smoke, 2 1,000-pound bombs smashed into Shōhō. One bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded deep in the hangar, instantly turning the enclosed hangar into an inferno of burning aviation fuel and wrecked aircraft. Black smoke gushed upward as secondary explosions, ammunition or fueled planes igniting, shook the ship. In the same moment, a swarm of TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Lexington's torpedo squadron swept in at low altitude. They approached from both port and starboard, skimmed over the waves, and released a deadly spread of torpedoes aimed at the writhing carrier. Eyewitness accounts say up to 5 torpedoes struck home almost simultaneously. A massive waterspout erupted alongside Shōhō as one torpedo's warhead blasted her starboard side. The torpedo hits ripped open compartments, knocking out Shōhō's steering and power and flooding both engine rooms and boiler rooms in an instant. The lights went out all over the ship, and Shōhō began to slow to a crawl, trailing smoke and listing slightly from the underwater damage. Shōhō was now a burning, crippled target. But the assault was not over. Yorktown's air group arrived moments later to deliver the coup de grace. At 11:25 a.m., a new wave of Dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown dove through the cloud cover. With Shōhō dead in the water and minimal defensive fire, they struck with impunity. Japanese crew on the cruisers nearby watched in horror as about 11 more 1,000-pound bombs crashed into Shōhō, one after another. These hits tore the flight deck to shreds and added fuel to the raging fires below. Explosions blew large holes in the flight deck and sent debris showering into the sky. In quick succession, Yorktown's Devastator torpedo planes swooped in at 11:29 a.m. and launched another salvo of torpedoes at the wallowing carrier. American pilots later claimed up to 10 torpedo hits in total during the attack, though Japanese reports indicate perhaps 2 additional torpedo impacts beyond the earlier ones. Whether it was 5 or 7 torpedoes in all, the effect was the same. Shōhō was mortally wounded. By this point, Shōhō was enveloped in thick black smoke, flames leaping from multiple deck gashes. The few Japanese cap fighters still aloft made desperate strafing runs on the attacking torpedo bombers, but US Navy Wildcats pounced on them. In the skirmish above the dying carrier, 2 of Shōhō's clawed fighters and 1 Zero were shot down by American F-4Fs, effectively wiping out her air defense. At 11:31 a.m., with his ship afire from stem to stern and slowing to a stop, Captain Izawa gave the heart-wrenching order to abandon ship. Crewmen threw rafts and lashed together debris overboard, and hundreds of sailors began leaping into the oil-slicked sea as fires raged around them. Just minutes later, at 11:35 a.m., Shōhō gave a final shudder and slipped beneath the waves, stern first, in the Coral Sea. She had fought on her very first and only combat operation, and in that short span, she became the first Japanese aircraft carrier lost in the war. The sinking of Shōhō was confirmed. However, the ordeal was not over for her crew. Roughly 300 Japanese sailors survived the initial sinking, bobbing in the water amid wreckage. But Admiral Goto's remaining ships, fearing more air attacks, withdrew at high speed without stopping to pick up survivors. For hours, Shōhō's men were left scattered in the open ocean. Only in the mid-afternoon did Goto cautiously dispatch the destroyer Sazanami back to the area to search for survivors. What Sazanami found was grim. Of the carrier's entire complement, over 800 crew and airmen, only 203 men were still alive to be rescued, including Captain Izawa. The remaining 630-plus officers and crew had gone down with Shōhō or perished in the sea. It was a devastating loss of life for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and it all unfolded in barely half an hour of ferocious combat. The destruction of Shōhō had an immediate operational impact. With her gone, and fleet carrier Shokaku damaged, the Port Moresby invasion convoy no longer had sufficient air cover. Japan, fearing Allied carrier and land-based attacks, ordered the convoy to withdraw. For Japan, Shōhō's loss was a sobering first. She was the first Japanese aircraft carrier sunk in World War II, and her destruction underscored the vulnerability of lightly protected carriers with small air groups when confronted by massed carrier strikes. In Tokyo, the loss was downplayed, but among naval officers, it was a reminder that even secondary carriers could become primary targets if caught unsupported. For the Allies, her sinking was a significant morale boost. After months of largely unbroken Japanese successes, Shōhō's fate demonstrated that Japan's carrier fleet was not invincible, and that aggressive use of carrier air power could deliver decisive blows. Shōhō was never replaced, and no ship would carry her name again. Though overshadowed by later battles, her destruction marked an important opening blow in a year that would later see Japan's carrier strength steadily eroded. It is mid-December 1944 in the Pacific Theater's final act. The newly commissioned Japanese aircraft carrier, Unryū, slips out of Kure Naval Base under cover of winter skies. She is bound for the embattled Philippines, carrying desperately needed reinforcements and weapons to a garrison on the brink. Escorted by 3 destroyers, Unryū cuts through the East China Sea, on what is both her maiden operational voyage and, unbeknownst to her crew, her final journey. As one of Japan's last remaining fleet carriers, Unryū represents a glimmer of hope for a navy in decline. Yet in these perilous waters stalk unseen predators. Within 2 days, the fate of Unryū will be sealed beneath the waves, marking the end of a carrier that barely tasted service. Unryū was the lead ship of a class of aircraft carriers conceived in urgency and shaped by circumstance. Her name means Cloud Dragon, echoing the tradition of auspicious creature names for Japanese carriers. She was ordered in 1941 as part of an emergency naval build-up. The Imperial Navy's answer was the Unryū class, a series of fleet carriers designed for rapid construction to replenish fleet strength. In concept, it was Japan's attempt at a mass-produced carrier program, akin to the US Navy's prolific Essex class, but on a smaller scale and constrained by limited resources. Design-wise, Unryū was essentially an updated repeat of the earlier Hiryu-type carrier. She measured about 746 feet in length and displaced roughly 20,000 tons at full load, making her mid-sized compared to Japan's earlier big carriers like Shokaku or the armoured Taiho. To save time and material, the Unryū class had no heavy armour plating on their flight decks or hulls. Instead, the design prioritized speed and ease of construction. Unryū's hull and machinery were based on proven cruiser components, giving her a powerful 152,000 shaft horsepower plant. This propelled the carrier to a respectable top speed of about 34 knots, fast enough to keep up with the battle fleet. Her endurance was around 8,000 nautical miles at cruise speed, ample for Pacific operations, at least when fuel was available. The carrier's aviation facilities were designed to accommodate up to around 60 to 65 aircraft, along with a few reconnaissance planes. However, owing to Japan's mounting aircraft and pilot shortages by 1944, Unryū never embarked anything close to her full complement. In reality, she mostly carried a few dozen Zero fighters and a handful of scout planes during her brief career, a token force reflecting the scarcity of trained aircrews and aircraft in late war Japan. Unryū's defensive outfit was formidable for anti-aircraft purposes, as was typical for late war Japanese ships. She mounted 6 twin, 5-inch dual-purpose guns along the sides of her flight deck for heavy AA fire. Far more numerous were her light AA guns. Over 70 barrels of 25mm automatic cannons in triple and single mounts dotted her decks. In addition, Unryū and her sisters were fitted with 12cm 4.7-inch multi-barrel rocket launchers as a last-ditch anti-aircraft measure. These weapons reflected lessons learned under relentless American air attack, though ironically, Unryū would never face an airstrike during her service. Crucially, unlike Taiho, the Unryū class did not have an armoured flight deck or extensive torpedo protection, sacrifices made to speed up construction. Some minor improvements were incorporated, such as additional internal bulkheads around fuel tanks and magazines, but the ships remained vulnerable to undersea damage. This vulnerability would prove fateful. Still, when Unryū was laid down on August 1, 1942, there was optimism that swift building could yield a new flotilla of carriers. Originally, 16 Unryū-class carriers were planned under wartime expansion programs. In practice, Japan's strained industry and shifting priorities meant only 3 were completed before war's end: Unryū and 2 sisters, Amagi and Katsuragi. Many others were suspended or cancelled as the tide of war turned. Unryū, launched in September 1943 and commissioned on August 6, 1944, would be the only member of her class to undertake an operational mission during the conflict. Unryū's active career was strikingly short and uneventful, a consequence of timing and Japan's dire strategic situation. Upon her commissioning in August 1944, the carrier joined the Third Fleet and spent the next few months in home waters. Initial shakedown cruises and training took place in Tokyo Bay and the sheltered Seto Inland Sea, where she could conduct flight operations away from enemy eyes. By this stage of the war, Japan was desperately short on fuel, so Unryū's movements were kept to a minimum. Her role was largely that of a reserve asset and training platform rather than a frontline strike carrier. Throughout the autumn of 1944, Unryū and her fledgling crew practiced carrier operations in relative safety. They performed takeoff and landing drills, damage control exercises, and coordinated maneuvers with other ships. However, the carrier's air group was never fully fleshed out due to the scarcity of planes and pilots. The men aboard were keenly aware that their ship was one of very few carriers left to the Imperial Navy. In late October 1944, as the Battle of Leyte Gulf raged to the south, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of Japan's carrier forces, briefly made Unryū his flagship. This was a poignant reflection of reality. Ozawa's mobile fleet had just been decimated off the Philippines, losing flagship Zuikaku and 3 light carriers, and Unryū was one of the only capital ships available to hoist his flag. For about a week, from October 30th to November 7th, 1944, the Cloud Dragon hosted the Admiral on board, even though she did not see combat during that time. By mid-November, the situation evolved again. The mobile fleet was disbanded on November 15th, 1944, as there were simply not enough operational carriers left to justify a separate carrier fleet. Unryū was reassigned alongside her newly completed sister, Amagi. In late November, the carrier loaded a small contingent of aircraft, a mix of Zero fighters and B-6N torpedo planes, presumably in preparation for future operations or defense of the homeland. These were drawn from the 601st Naval Air Group, an amalgamated carrier air wing that by this time mostly operated from land bases due to the lack of seaworthy carriers. Unryū herself remained anchored or cruising short distances in the inland sea, conserving precious fuel and awaiting orders. Through these months, Unryū had not fired a shot in anger, nor ventured beyond Japan's own waters. Yet in December 1944, as Allied forces pressed closer, the Imperial Navy decided to commit Unryū to a do-or-die mission. American troops had landed in the Philippines, on Leyte in October, and more recently on Mindoro in mid-December, and a full-scale invasion of Luzon was imminent. The Japanese High Command, determined to bolster the Philippines' faltering defense, planned an emergency reinforcement convoy. Unryū, despite her untested crew and limited air group, was assigned to carry critical reinforcements to Luzon. It was an unusual assignment for a fleet carrier, essentially using her as a fast transport. But, with few alternatives left, the Navy was willing to risk one of its last carriers in hopes of delivering much-needed aid to the front. In the pre-dawn hours of December 17th, 1944, Unryū departed Kure and steamed into the East China Sea, heading south toward the Philippine Islands. The carrier's decks and hangars were not filled with the usual complement of strike aircraft for this voyage. Instead, they were loaded with crated airplanes, spare parts, and a secret new weapon, MXY-7 Oka rocket-powered kamikaze planes. 30 of these manned rocket gliders, essentially flying bombs intended for suicide attacks on Allied ships, were packed aboard Unryū for delivery to Manila. Along with them came munitions, aviation fuel, and hundreds of Army and Navy personnel bound for the Philippine front. In all, an extra load of around 1,500 tons of cargo and passengers was squeezed onto the carrier. This heavy load even saw equipment stored on parts of the flight deck, giving Unryū an unusual appearance as she set sail. It was clear that speed was of the essence. Every day counted as Allied forces tightened their grip on the Philippines. For the escort, the Imperial Navy assigned 3 destroyers, Shigura, Hinoki, and Momi, to screen Unryū during the voyage. Captain Kaname Konishi commanded the task group from Unryū's bridge. Morale on board was a mixture of determination and apprehension. Many sailors realized this mission was extremely risky. American submarines had become a lethal threat to Japanese shipping, prowling the waters from Formosa, Taiwan, to the home islands. The East China Sea, though traditionally considered near Japan's sphere, was no longer safe. Just weeks earlier, another prized new carrier, Shinano, had been sunk by a US submarine shortly after leaving port. Unryū's crew was doubtless aware of that disaster and kept vigilant watch for periscopes as they moved through the grey winter seas. 2 days into the journey, on December 19th, 1944, the task force's fears materialized. That afternoon, about 200 nautical miles southeast of Shanghai, the American submarine USS Redfish SS-395 detected Unryū's formation. Redfish had been patrolling aggressively in search of major targets, and could hardly miss the sizable silhouette of an aircraft carrier guarded by destroyers. The submarine's commander maneuvered into attack position. On board Unryū, there was little warning. The carrier's sonar and lookouts did not spot the submarine in time. At approximately 4:35 p.m., Redfish fired a spread of torpedoes at the unaware carrier. Suddenly, a shattering explosion rocked Unryū. One torpedo slammed into the starboard side forward, striking near the carrier's bow under the bridge. The detonation blew open a massive hole in the hull. In an instant, Unryū's forward boiler rooms were torn apart and flooded. The hit also severed main steam lines, robbing the ship of propulsion and electricity. Fires broke out amid the wreckage below decks, and the carrier immediately began to slow to a dead stop, listing a few degrees to starboard. Alarms rang out, and damage control parties rushed to their stations. Despite the chaos, the training and discipline of the crew took hold. They fought to keep the ship afloat, counter-flooding compartments to correct the list and attempting to isolate fires. On the bridge, Captain Konishi and his officers assessed the situation grimly. Unryū was crippled, but so far still afloat. There was hope that with quick action, they might control the flooding and perhaps even get underway again on auxiliary power, or by routing steam from remaining boilers. Meanwhile, the escorting destroyers sprang into action, commencing evasive maneuvers and beginning a desperate hunt for the attacker. The nearest moved in to drop depth charges in the vicinity, where Redfish might be lurking beneath the waves. Columns of water erupted as depth charges detonated, but they failed to find their mark. The submarine, after firing, had dived deep to evade counterattack. For a brief period, the immediate danger to Unryū seemed to have passed. The carrier's crew managed to get some steam pressure back and attempted to restart the engines to limp away. Slowly, Unryū began moving once more, leaving an oil slick in her wake. Barely 15 minutes after the first hit, Redfish struck again. The submarine, undetected, had maneuvered for a second salvo. Another torpedo sliced through the water and struck Unryū on the starboard side once more, this time near the middle of the ship, roughly under the forward aircraft elevator. This area of the ship was particularly vulnerable. It lay adjacent to the forward aviation gasoline storage tanks and directly below the hangar deck where the Oka rockets were stowed. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic. The torpedo's blast ignited the volatile aviation fuel, producing a massive fireball that gouted out of the elevator well. In the same instant, a chain reaction occurred. The stored Oka warheads and explosives in the hangar detonated in a sympathetic blast. A tremendous explosion tore through Unryū's forward section, essentially blowing the bow of the ship apart. Debris, flames, and smoke burst from the carrier's shattered hull, visible for miles. Within moments, Unryū was mortally wounded. Captain Konishi, understanding the situation, gave the order to abandon ship as the list reached around 30 degrees. Crewmen scrambled to launch life rafts and dive into the cold, rough sea, fighting against time as the ship tilted more and more. In a mere 7 minutes after the second torpedo hit, Unryū succumbed. With a final metallic groan, the carrier rolled almost onto her side with a 90-degree list and slipped beneath the waves, ending Unryū's service just 4 months after it had begun. The disaster was abrupt and devastating in its toll. Hundreds of men went into the water as Unryū sank, but most would not survive. The combination of the explosions and the ship's swift plunge trapped many crew below decks. Others who escaped faced oil-slicked, frigid seas and the fading December daylight. The destroyer Shigure immediately turned to rescue survivors, despite the threat of the still roaming submarine. Shigure's crew braved the risk and plucked survivors from the water into the night. Ultimately, only 145 men from Unryū's roughly 1,400 complement were saved. That number included some of the escorting army personnel and possibly a handful of the Special Attack Unit men, but it meant that over 1,200 souls were lost with the carrier. Among those likely lost were Captain Konishi and most of the ship's officers. The tragedy of Unryū's sinking was one of the greatest single ship losses of life for the Imperial Navy in the closing months of the war. USS Redfish managed to escape despite aggressive counterattacks by the remaining destroyers. The submarine endured depth charges and even a battering from one of the escorts, suffering damage but ultimately surviving to report the kill. For the American crew of Redfish, the sinking of Unryū was a significant victory, one less carrier to face in the Pacific, but for the Japanese Navy, it was yet another bitter blow. In the immediate aftermath, Shigure and the other destroyers retreated toward friendly waters, carrying the few exhausted survivors of Unryū. Shigure arrived at Sasebo on December 22, 1944, where the rescued crewmen finally set foot on land, shaken and grief-stricken. The loss of Unryū was kept relatively quiet by the Japanese Navy. At this late stage of the war, bad news was often concealed to maintain morale. Still, within naval circles, the sinking underscored a harsh reality. In less than 2 months, Japan had lost 2 large aircraft carriers, the giant Shinano in November and now Unryū in December, to American submarines, without either ship ever engaging in combat operations. These incidents highlighted Japan's inability to safeguard even its most valuable new warships in waters that were once considered secure. Unryū's sinking left the Imperial Japanese Navy with virtually no operational fleet carriers at sea. Her sister ship Akagi was still fitting out and would be heavily damaged by US air raids before she could be used. The third completed sister, Katsuragi, never left Japanese harbours due to fuel shortages, surviving the war only to be scrapped afterward. Other smaller carriers that Japan had, such as Ryūhō or converted escort carriers, were either stuck in port or used minimally. In effect, the dream of a revitalized carrier force through the Unryū class had evaporated. For the Philippines campaign, Unryū's ill-fated final mission had no impact on slowing the Allied advance. The supplies and Oka weapons she carried went down with the ship, never reaching Luzon's defenders. By early January 1945, American forces landed on Luzon as planned, and the Japanese garrison, lacking both reinforcements and sufficient air support, continued its fight in isolation. Unryū's demise was thus part of the larger narrative of Japan's waning power in late 1944. It symbolized the twilight of Japan's carrier era, a modern warship conceived in hope but dispatched in desperation, ultimately sunk without ever launching a strike. In a broader sense, the sinking marked the end of an era for the Imperial Navy. Once, carriers like Akagi, Kaga, and Zuikaku had spearheaded offensive operations across the Pacific. Now, with Unryū's loss, almost nothing remained of that proud carrier fleet. The men who survived her sinking would continue the war in other capacities, some reassigned to infantry units or to air-based defense, as Japan prepared for the expected invasion of its home islands. Many of their comrades lay entombed with the Cloud Dragon on the ocean floor, a solemn testament to the ferocity of the Pacific War. Historically, Unryū's service was brief. From her hurried construction to her swift destruction, she exemplified the Imperial Japanese Navy's last, faltering attempts to project power in a conflict that was increasingly hopeless. Unryū never fired a gun in battle or launched an airstrike, yet her sinking stands as a significant event, the sinking of one of Japan's final fleet carriers, a ship whose first mission became her last. Unryū's fate underlines the last ultimate eclipse of Japan's naval air power, coming full circle from its meteoric rise at Pearl Harbor to its destruction and defeat less than 4 years later. In late October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's aircraft carrier, Zuikaku, was fighting for her life. Swarms of US carrier aircraft pounded the veteran ship during the climactic battle off Cape Engano, part of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf. By early afternoon on October 25th, Zuikaku was dead in the water, aflame and listing heavily to port. With their ship mortally wounded, her surviving crew gathered on the sloping flight deck, gave a final banzai cheer, and began to abandon the vessel. Minutes later, the proud carrier capsized and sank beneath the waves, becoming the last of the 6 Japanese carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor to be lost in World War II. Explore how Zuikaku rose as one of Japan's most formidable fleet carriers, her design and specifications, highlights of her wartime service, and how she met her end in a desperate final mission. Zuikaku was the second of the 2 Shokaku-class fleet carriers, built as part of Japan's pre-war naval expansion. Laid down in 1938 and commissioned in September 1941, she was among the most advanced carriers of her time, displacing over 32,000 tons fully loaded and stretching 844 feet, or 257 meters in length. Her propulsion system of 4 steam turbine engines delivered 160,000 shaft horsepower, driving her to a speed of about 34.5 knots, fast enough to keep pace with Japan's carrier task forces. She carried a designed complement of around 1,660 officers and crew, not including her air wing, and could steam over 9,700 nautical miles at cruising speed, giving her the range needed for long-range Pacific operations. In terms of aircraft capacity, Zuikaku was initially rated to carry about 72 operational aircraft, plus 12 spares. On the eve of the Pacific War, her embarked air group included a mix of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, Aichi D-3 A-Val dive bombers, and Nakajima B 5N Kate torpedo bombers, the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation in 1941. Zuikaku's armament and protection reflected a balance of offensive reach and defensive strength. She mounted 8 twin 127mm Type 89 dual-purpose guns along the sides of the hull. These 5-inch guns could be used against both aircraft and surface targets. For close-in air defense, Zuikaku was originally equipped with 12 triple-mount 25mm Type 96 anti-aircraft guns. The 25mm guns, though numerous, proved to have limited effectiveness against fast-moving aircraft due to their small magazines and severe vibration when firing. In terms of armor, Zuikaku was better protected than earlier Japanese carriers. Critical areas like ammunition magazines were safeguarded by up to 165mm of armor on the belts, with armored decks up to 132mm over vital spaces. The waterline belt elsewhere was thinner, 46 to 75mm in most places, but backed by supportive steel plating to localize damage. Zuikaku and her sister, Shokaku, were built under Japan's ambition to field a first-rate carrier fleet. As part of the first air fleet, known more commonly as the Kido Butai, were intended to be the spearhead for long-range offensive operations. Zuikaku's very name, Auspicious Crane, reflected a hopeful omen of good fortune. Fittingly, she would earn a reputation as a lucky ship, emerging unscathed or lightly damaged from multiple battles that wrecked other carriers. However, as the war progressed, Zuikaku's design would be tested to the limits, and her capabilities continuously updated to meet new threats. Zuikaku was commissioned just in time to join Japan's carrier striking force for the opening offensives of World War II. In fact, she started the Pacific War as a frontline carrier of the Kido Butai. Under the command of Captain Yokokawa Ichibei, Zuikaku's first operational mission was the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Along with 5 other fleet carriers, she launched waves of aircraft that struck American airfields and warships in Hawaii, hoping to cripple the US Pacific Fleet's battleships in one bold stroke. Zuikaku's air group focused on hitting airfield targets during the raid, contributing to Japan's initial successes. This devastating opening left the United States reeling and showcased the initial power and potential of Japan's mobile carrier forces. Following Pearl Harbor, Zuikaku continued to spearhead offensive operations during Japan's early war southern advance. In January-March 1942, she took part in raids throughout the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia, including strikes on Rabaul and the Dutch East Indies. In April 1942, Zuikaku joined Admiral Nagumo's carrier fleet in the Indian Ocean raid, where her dive bombers and torpedo planes helped hunt down and sink Allied ships. Notably, aircraft from Zuikaku and her sister Shokaku contributed to sinking the British carrier HMS Hermes and 2 cruisers, Cornwall and Dorsetshire, during these operations. These early victories further cemented Zuikaku's reputation as a formidable carrier. She emerged without significant damage while dealing heavy blows to the enemy. One of Zuikaku's most important engagements came in May 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Zuikaku and Shokaku formed the core of the Japanese carrier force. On May 7th to 8th, 1942, their planes clashed with US Navy carriers Lexington and Yorktown. In the intense exchanges, Zuikaku's air crews scored significant hits. Her torpedo bombers were credited with delivering crippling blows that led to the sinking of USS Lexington on May 8th. They also damaged USS Yorktown, though Yorktown survived Coral Sea to fight another day. However, the victory came at a cost. Shokaku was severely bombed and knocked out of action, and Zuikaku's air group suffered heavy losses in experienced pilots and planes. With one carrier damaged and the other short on aircraft, the Shokaku-class sisters were unable to participate in the next major showdown at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. This twist of fate arguably saved Zuikaku, as Midway proved catastrophic for Japan's other carriers. While Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were sunk at Midway, Zuikaku sat safely in port, replenishing her squadrons. This earned her further fame as the Lucky Crane, avoiding the disaster that befell her comrades. Through late 1942, Zuikaku remained a pillar of Japan's embattled carrier force in the Guadalcanal campaign. She took part in the carrier battle of the Eastern Solomons and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. At Santa Cruz, her flyers achieved a notable success. Together with other Japanese carriers' planes, they bombed and helped sink USS Hornet. Zuikaku again avoided serious damage to herself. Although targeted by US dive bombers, she maneuvered skillfully, and her anti-air gunners fought off attacks, sustaining only minor hits or near misses. The battle was costly for both sides' air groups, but Japan emerged with a tactical victory. After late 1942, there was a prolonged lull in carrier battles. Throughout 1943, Zuikaku saw no major action as the Japanese Navy, badly depleted of experienced pilots, avoided committing its carriers to battle. Instead, she spent much of this period refitting, training new air groups, and occasionally ferrying aircraft to distant bases. It was during this time that many of her armaments were upgraded to better prepare her for the next showdown. That showdown came in June 1944 with the Battle of the Philippine Sea. By now, Zuikaku had been made flagship of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet, a testament to her status as the fleet's senior-most carrier. On June 19th to 20th, 1944, Ozawa launched Japan's last major carrier offensive against the US Fifth Fleet defending the Mariana Islands. The battle turned into what Americans nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as Japan's once elite naval aviators, now largely green replacements, were massacred by superior US fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Over the two-day battle, Japan lost 3 carriers, including Shokaku, sunk by a US submarine, and approximately 400 aircraft. Zuikaku survived, but even she did not escape unharmed. She took a few bomb hits from American carrier planes, though Japanese damage control teams managed to contain the damage. More importantly, by battle's end, Zuikaku had lost the majority of her planes and veteran pilots to combat or crash landings. The once mighty carrier air groups were effectively gutted. The Philippine Sea was a strategic disaster for Japan. Despite being quickly repaired, she faced an acute shortage of trained airmen and aircraft. Nonetheless, in October 1944, with the Allied invasion of the Philippines underway, Japan resolved to make one last grand use of its carriers, even if it meant using them as bait. Zuikaku, still considered fortunate and carrying Japan's hopes, would soon embark on her final mission. By fall 1944, the Japanese Navy was cornered and desperate. Allied forces had landed on Leyte, central Philippines, threatening to cut off Japan's access to vital resources. In response, the IJN launched Operation Shōhō, a complex counterattack plan. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was tasked with commanding the Northern Force, essentially a decoy carrier task force meant to lure the US Third Fleet away from Leyte. Zuikaku, as the largest and most prestigious carrier left, served as Ozawa's flagship in this force. It was a role far different from her glory days. The once powerful carrier was now largely stripped of offensive punch and sent out as sacrificial bait. Japanese planners hoped that American Admiral William F. Halsey, commanding the US Third Fleet's formidable fast carriers, would chase Ozawa's carriers, thereby leaving the invasion fleet vulnerable to attack by Japanese battleships coming from the west. On October 20th, 1944, Zuikaku loaded the remnants of Japan's carrier air power and sailed with Ozawa from Japan into the Philippine Sea. Her escort included 3 light carriers, Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, 2 hybrid battleship carriers, Issei and Hyuga, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers. It was a formidable-looking force on paper, but largely an empty shell. In total, the 4 carriers of Ozawa's 3rd Carrier Division could field only about 108 aircraft between them, a fraction of their capacity, and most of those were inexperienced aircrews or second-line planes. Despite these shortcomings, the carriers sortied bravely, knowing their mission was essentially a one-way trip. On October 24th, as US reconnaissance detected Ozawa's approach from the north, the decoy plan began to work. Halsey's powerful task force took the bait and steamed northward, away from Leyte Gulf, in pursuit of the Japanese carrier force. That morning, Ozawa launched what aircraft he could in a token strike against the US fleet. From Zuikaku's decks and the light carriers, several dozen planes took off, many piloted by inexperienced youths. This strike was largely ineffective. Most of the Japanese aircraft failed to find Halsey's distant carriers, and either were shot down or turned back low on fuel. In any case, virtually none of Zuikaku's planes returned to her. By the end of October 24th, Zuikaku had effectively no air group left to speak of. She was now a carrier in name only, carrying little more than the proud history of her past battles. The stage was set for the final confrontation on October 25th, 1944, the battle off Cape Engano. At dawn, Admiral Halsey's carriers launched massive airstrikes upon spotting Ozawa's force off the northeastern tip of Luzon. Wave after wave of US Navy aircraft swept down on the 4 Japanese carriers. Zuikaku came under heavy attack from several directions. Her captains and crew fought back with everything they had, maneuvering at flank speed, swerving to avoid torpedoes, and throwing up dense flak from her dozens of anti-aircraft guns. But the Americans were overwhelmingly powerful and numerous. Dive bombers from carriers Essex, Intrepid, Lexington, and others aimed for the flight decks and hangars, while squadrons of torpedo-bombing Grumman Avengers attacked from low altitude. By mid-morning, bombs and torpedoes found their marks on Zuikaku. She sustained multiple bomb strikes that ripped open her flight deck and set fires raging internally. Soon after, aerial torpedoes struck her hull. According to post-battle analysis, Zuikaku was ultimately hit by an onslaught of 7 torpedoes and 9 bombs during these attacks. One by one, her vital systems faltered. Engines were knocked out, compartments flooded uncontrollably, and fires spread through the hangar deck. Damage control teams attempted to counter-flood and keep the ship afloat, but the cumulative damage was too extensive. Water poured into her port side, and Zuikaku began listing increasingly to port, as well as down by the stern. Around noon, with Zuikaku clearly dying, Vice Admiral Ozawa made the decision to transfer his flag off the stricken carrier. He and his staff departed in a small boat and moved over to the cruiser Oyodo, from which Ozawa continued to direct the remnant of his force. Meanwhile, the pounding of Zuikaku continued. US pilots pressed their attacks until the once mighty carrier was left dead in the water, billowing smoke. By about 1 p.m., the order was given on board Zuikaku to abandon ship. The flight deck was now sloping sharply due to the list. Sailors gathered on the exposed side of the ship. In a moment, filled with both pride and sorrow, Zuikaku's crew lowered the Imperial Navy ensign and performed ceremonial last rites for their ship. They stood in formation and offered a final banzai salute to the Emperor and their beloved carrier before casting themselves into the sea. Just 16 minutes later, Zuikaku rolled over to port and sank, stern first, beneath the waves. Zuikaku's end was accompanied by heavy loss of life. Out of her approximately 1,700 crew and officers on board that day, an estimated 840 were killed in the sinking. Another 860-plus survivors were rescued from the water by Japanese destroyers Wakatsuki and Kuwa, as well as other escorting ships. Captain Kaizuka Takeo, Zuikaku's commanding officer, who had been promoted from captain to rear admiral just days earlier, chose to go down with his command. One of the 840 lost. With Zuikaku's sinking, all 4 Japanese carriers in the Northern Force were destroyed at Cape Engano. The light carriers Chitose and Chiyoda were bombed, torpedoed, and sunk earlier in the day, and Zuiho was fatally hit and sank in the afternoon. Ozawa's decoy force had been annihilated, but it had achieved its aim of diverting Halsey. Indeed, while Zuikaku and her sisters were being pounded by Admiral Halsey's aviators, far to the south, another drama was unfolding. The Japanese central force of battleships and cruisers had surged through the unguarded San Bernardino Strait. That force surprised a group of US escort carriers and destroyers off Samar, leading to the famous Battle off Samar. In a sense, Zuikaku's sacrificial mission succeeded. Halsey was lured away, allowing the Japanese battleships a chance, albeit brief, to wreak havoc. However, even this gambit could not turn the tide of the war. Kurita's battleships were ultimately driven off at Samar, and the overall Battle of Leyte Gulf ended in a decisive Allied victory. The Imperial Japanese Navy had gambled and lost, suffering catastrophic losses of ships and men. The sinking of Zuikaku symbolized the twilight of Japan's naval air power. In the immediate aftermath, the Imperial Japanese Navy was left decimated. Most of its remaining carriers, battleships, and cruisers had been sunk or heavily damaged. Leyte Gulf delivered a blow from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. Zuikaku's loss, alongside those of Musashi and countless other ships, meant that Japan no longer had the means to challenge Allied control of the seas. Although some ships and a few newly built carriers remained on paper, they were either too few, too poorly equipped, or lacked fuel and air groups to be operational. After October 1944, Japan's carrier force ceased to be a meaningful offensive threat. When the war entered its final months, desperate measures like kamikaze attacks became Japan's primary naval air strategy, a stark contrast to the sweeping carrier strikes that Zuikaku had once led. In Japan, the loss of Zuikaku was kept relatively quiet at first, much as other naval defeats had been. But in hindsight, Japanese naval officers recognized the ship's fate as a turning point. Zuikaku, had been one of the last links to the heyday of the Imperial Navy's carrier force. Her destruction underscored that Japan's ability to wage conventional carrier warfare was effectively over. The combined fleet was shattered, and the initiative at sea had irrevocably passed to the Allies. Allied sailors and commanders, on the other hand, viewed Zuikaku's sinking as a major success and a form of closure. Nearly 3 years earlier, her air group had attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, she was at the bottom of the ocean, avenging those early defeats and proving the overwhelming superiority of US naval power by late 1944. Historians often regard Zuikaku and her sister Shokaku as among the most capable carriers of World War II, noting that they were the most successful carriers operated by the Japanese in terms of operational output and resilience. Zuikaku's career spanned the duration of Japan's naval fortunes, from triumphant offensive operations in 1941 to 42 to the defensive, sacrificial mindset of 1944. Her story provides insight into how quickly the tide turned in the Pacific War. In less than 4 years, the Imperial Navy went from having arguably the world's most powerful carrier strike force to using its last carrier as bait in a fallacy. In the broader context, Zuikaku's destruction, along with the annihilation of Japan's carrier fleet at Leyte Gulf, validated the US Navy's overwhelming carrier-centered strategy. IJN Zuikaku holds a place in history as the last survivor of the first generation of Japanese carriers, and her fate vividly illustrates the rise and fall of a naval empire. From her auspicious beginnings as a state-of-the-art warship to her fiery end as a decoy, Zuikaku's journey is a microcosm of the Pacific War itself. Her story is one of the immense gambles of war and the swift changes in fortune that defined World War II at sea. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Pacific on November 28, 1944, the colossal carrier Shinano slipped out of the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal under a veil of secrecy. Shinano was the largest carrier ever built up to that time and Japan's newest naval marvel, her crew unaware that within hours they would be fighting for their lives. Nearby, lurking beneath the waves, the American submarine USS Archerfish silently trailed the carrier's zigzagging silhouette. The stage was set for an unprecedented encounter, a duel between the world's biggest carrier and a lone submarine. How did this top-secret supercarrier, believed by her makers to be nearly unsinkable, end up at the bottom of the ocean on her very first voyage? This is the story of Shinano's only mission, a tale of ambitious design, desperate secrecy, and fatal miscalculation that culminated in one of World War II's most dramatic naval blunders. Shinano's story began with the Yamato-class battleships, an embodiment of Imperial Japan's naval might. Laid down on May 4, 1940, Shinano was originally intended to be the third super battleship in the Yamato class, alongside her sister ships Yamato and Musashi. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 saw Japan lose 4 of its fleet aircraft carriers, Akagi, Hiryu, Kaga, and Soryu, in a single battle. In the aftermath, Japan's naval planners urgently needed to rebuild carrier strength. So, even as Shinano's hull rose on the slipway as a battleship, the Imperial Japanese Navy made a dramatic decision: convert Shinano into an aircraft carrier rather than finish her out as a battleship. Her partially built hull provided a massive, armoured foundation for what they hoped would be an unparalleled carrier. This was no easy redesign. The conversion was almost as challenging as starting from scratch. Shinano's conversion took over 2 years, a process slowed by resource shortages and Allied air raids. The advanced state of her battleship construction meant she couldn't become a traditional fleet carrier with multiple hangar decks like purpose-built carriers. Instead, designers turned Shinano into a support carrier, essentially a giant floating fortress and resupply ship for Japan's remaining carriers. She would carry reserve aircraft, fuel, and munitions to sustain other carriers in battle, as well as launch a limited air wing of her own if needed. Her single hangar deck and slightly shorter flight deck reflected this specialized role. Built on a Yamato-class hull, Shinano was immense in size. She measured about 872 feet in length and displaced roughly 70,000 tons at full load, by far the largest aircraft carrier of World War II. Shinano's defensive armament was formidable as well, with 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns and over 100 anti-aircraft guns. Yet for all her size and strength, Shinano was also a product of haste and compromise. The conversion was rushed as Japan's war fortunes worsened. By late 1944, construction was behind schedule. Originally expected to be completed in 1945, Shinano's finishing work was pushed forward after another major defeat in mid-1944 left Japan desperate for new warships. Shortages of materials and skilled labor led to many shortcuts. Still, by November 1944, the massive carrier was deemed just ready enough for a trial voyage, even if she was not truly combat ready. From the outset, Shinano's existence was kept top secret. Her construction at Yokosuka was hidden behind high fences and tight security. Workers were confined to the naval yard and forbidden from talking about what they were building. This veil of secrecy was so effective that no official photographs of Shinano were taken during construction. Only a few clandestine snapshots exist, one by a Japanese plane to check her camouflage, and one by a high-flying American B-29. Strategically, Shinano was meant to be Japan's trump card after the carrier losses at Midway. If the Allies learned of her, she'd become a prime target before ever seeing battle. Thus, Japanese High Command wanted Shinano hidden until she could make a difference in a decisive engagement. They envisioned her as a pivotal support unit for the defensive battles to come. Shinano could ferry dozens of replacement aircraft, stockpile huge amounts of fuel and ordnance, and even carry specialized kamikaze weapons like rocket-powered Oka gliders. In essence, she would be a mobile logistics base and backup carrier to keep Japan's remaining fleet carriers in the fight. By late 1944, however, time was running out. The US Navy's advance across the Pacific had brought the war to Japan's doorstep, and Yokosuka was growing vulnerable to air attack. Japanese leaders decided to move Shinano to the safer Kure naval base in western Japan to complete her fitting out. The transfer would also allow Shinano to pick up a load of new weapons bound for the front lines. Secrecy remained paramount. Japan did not announce Shinano's commissioning to the public, and her maiden voyage would be under strict radio silence and cover of darkness. On November 19, 1944, Shinano was commissioned at Yokosuka, just 10 days before her sinking. Captain Toshio Abe, a seasoned officer, took command of the ship and its crew of about 2,000. He quickly saw that the gigantic carrier was far from battle-ready. Workers were still crawling over Shinano, installing equipment and finishing critical systems. Many of her watertight doors and bulkheads were incomplete or untested, a serious safety risk. Pumps and damage control gear were missing or not fully functional. Captain Toshio Abe, alarmed by these problems, pleaded for more time to conduct sea trials and ensure the ship was seaworthy. But Navy High Command was adamant. Shinano must sail to Kure immediately to get her out of vulnerable Yokosuka. The threat of a catastrophic air raid on the shipyard loomed larger in their minds than the danger of sending an unfinished ship to sea. In the frantic days before departure, Shinano's crew worked around the clock alongside hundreds of civilian yard workers to prepare. The ship was loaded with 50 Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka kamikaze rocket gliders and several Shinyo suicide boats, special attack craft being ferried for use in upcoming battles. These were crammed into her hangar and on deck, effectively turning the carrier into a transport for kamikaze weapons on this trip. Importantly, Shinano did not yet have her own air group aboard. Her complement of carrier aircraft and trained pilots would come later, after additional training. So on this maiden voyage, Shinano was essentially a massive armed ferry without any aircraft of her own. By the afternoon of November 28, 1944, Shinano was hastily declared fit for sea. At 6 p.m. that evening, she slipped out of Yokosuka and headed into the night, flanked by her 3 destroyer escorts, Yukikaze, Isukaze, and Hamikaze. The departure was anticlimactic. No ceremony or fanfare, just the huge silhouette gliding away from the dock as anxious workers looked on. Once clear of Tokyo Bay, Shinano set a southwesterly course into the Philippine Sea, planning to swing around southern Japan and then cut north through the Bungo Strait into the inland sea. Captain Toshio Abe kept her at about 20 knots and zigzagging to make targeting difficult. All exterior lights were extinguished. Lookouts scanned the black horizon. They knew American submarines prowled these waters. Still, with Japan's coast nearby, Abe hoped to slip through unseen. Around 10:30 p.m., Shinano's lookouts spotted a submarine's conning tower in the moonlight. One escort, Isukaze, rushed to attack. Captain Toshio Abe, suspecting a decoy, called it back. Instead, Shinano turned away and increased speed to try to outrun the sub. For a while, it seemed she might escape, but just before midnight, a mechanical problem forced Shinano to slow to 18 knots, about the same speed as the pursuing sub. Archerfish kept pace and maneuvered into position to strike. In the early hours of November 29, 1944, the opportunity finally came. Shinano made a wide zigzag turn that exposed her entire side to the lurking Archerfish. At 3:15 a.m., Archerfish fired a spread of 6 torpedoes from close range and then dove deep. Minutes later, 4 colossal explosions ripped into Shinano's starboard side. The torpedoes had hit their mark. The first torpedo blasted open compartments near the stern, including refrigerated stores and an empty aviation fuel tank, ripping a huge gash below the armored belt. The second struck further forward, crumpling bulkheads around one of the engine rooms and flooding it. The third detonated under a boiler room, obliterating that compartment and causing 2 adjacent boiler rooms to flood as well. The fourth hit near an air compressor room and magazines, wrecking another damage control station and rupturing a fuel oil tank. In less than 2 minutes, Shinano had suffered grievous wounds along a vast stretch of her starboard side. Critically, many compartments that should have been watertight were not sealed due to her incomplete state. Flooding spread far beyond the initial blast zones. Within minutes, Shinano began listing to starboard under the weight of thousands of tons of seawater. At first, nobody panicked. The crew had some basic training in damage control, and the officers believed Shinano's massive size and armor would keep her afloat. After all, she was the largest and best protected carrier in the world. Surely she could absorb a few torpedo hits. Damage control teams rushed to combat the flooding. Pumps were activated where possible, and counter-flooding was ordered on the port side to try to correct the list. On the bridge, Captain Toshio Abe assessed the situation. The starboard engine and boiler rooms were badly flooded, but there were no raging fires or secondary explosions. By about 15 minutes after the hits, Shinano's list was roughly 10 degrees to starboard, concerning, but not yet near fatal, for a ship of her width. Captain Abe remained optimistic and refused to slow down, but forging ahead at 18 knots only forced more water into Shinano's hull. Minutes ticked by, and her list worsened. The crew pumped out water as best they could, and briefly held the list around 12 degrees. But before long, more compartments were slowly flooding through unseen cracks and open hatches. By around 5 a.m., 2 hours after the attack, Shinano was listing over 15 degrees and settling lower in the water despite all efforts. Realizing now that the damage was far worse than hoped, Abe made a last-ditch move. He ordered Shinano to turn toward the nearest land, Shiono Point on Honshu, aiming to beach the ship in shallower water. He also directed additional counter-flooding on the port side to reduce the list. These measures gave only temporary relief. Soon, the starboard list increased again. By dawn, the list had exceeded 20 degrees. Flooding soon killed her remaining boilers, and by 7 a.m. Shinano was dead in the water, still taking on water and helpless. The escorts did everything possible to assist. Hamikaze and Isukaze tried to tow Shinano, but the sinking Leviathan barely moved. The destroyers simply lacked the power to tow a 70,000-ton ship now heavy with water. By 9 a.m., Shinano lost all power, plunging her interior into darkness and silencing her pumps. At this point, it was clear nothing could save the ship. Captain Toshio Abe finally turned his attention to saving lives. Around 10 a.m., with Shinano listing over 30 degrees, he ordered the crew to prepare to abandon ship. The carrier's huge flight deck was now tilted like a sinking ramp, making movement perilous. Crewmen scrambled to launch life rafts or simply jumped into the cold sea. The destroyers edged in to rescue as many men as they could. Following the honored tradition of Japanese captains, Captain Toshio Abe chose to remain on the bridge and go down with his ship, as did 2 of his senior officers. At 10:57 a.m. on November 29, 1944, about 7.5 hours after the torpedo strike, Shinano capsized to starboard and sank. The massive carrier rolled completely over and slid stern first beneath the waves. As she went down, a thunderous roar of collapsing metal echoed across the sea. For an unlucky few, the powerful suction and whirlpool dragged dozens of men down with the ship. In moments, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was gone, swallowed by the Pacific. The human cost was staggering. Of roughly 2,515 souls on board, about 1,435, including Captain Abe, went down with Shinano. Approximately 1,000 were plucked from the water by the escorts. Those survivors were quarantined on a small island, and the Japanese Navy enforced a strict news blackout to keep the loss of Shinano secret. Meanwhile, USS Archerfish slipped away. Right after firing, Enright had taken his sub deep to evade depth charges. The angry escorts plastered the area with explosives, but when Shinano's fate became obvious, they turned back to rescue survivors, allowing Archerfish to escape. Enright and his crew, listening underwater, heard rumblings and breaking up noises for over 40 minutes after their attack, convincing them that their target was sinking. At daybreak, Archerfish cautiously surfaced to find only empty ocean. They didn't know exactly what they had destroyed, but they knew it was something enormous. Shinano's sinking was a devastating blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy, though it remained secret until after the war. The loss of such a colossal ship just days after commissioning was unprecedented. Japan could ill afford it. By late 1944, the Empire had only a handful of carriers left, none anywhere near Shinano's size, and almost no capacity to build more. Plans for Shinano to serve as a mobile support base never materialized. Those special weapons she carried would have to find other ways to reach the front. Losing Shinano without ever serving even a fraction of her purpose was a bitter pill for Japan. The squandered potential and wasted resources embodied the nation's waning fortunes. For the Japanese, Shinano's demise taught several hard lessons. Shinano was pushed out to sea in an incomplete state. A weak joint in her hull, where the original battleship armor met the added carrier section, proved disastrous. All 4 torpedoes struck along this seam, magnifying the damage. Many compartments hadn't been pressure tested for water tightness. Leaks and gaps went unnoticed in the rush. Critical equipment, like pumps and backup generators, wasn't fully installed or operational. In short, sending an unready ship to sea cost Shinano her life. The crew had been aboard barely 10 days and was not fully drilled. When crisis came, they fought bravely, but without the coordination of a seasoned crew. Confusion and delays hampered efforts to isolate flooding and run pumps. The presence of 300 civilian technicians on board, untrained for combat situations, only added to the chaos. Even a supership is only as effective as the crew that mans her. Captain Toshio Abe initially underestimated the threat. Instead of stopping or slowing to contain the flooding, he kept the ship moving, which only worsened the ingress of water. This misjudgment proved fatal. Had Shinano immediately focused on damage control, she might have survived longer. In this case, human error and pride compounded the ship's physical vulnerabilities. On the American side, Shinano's destruction was a major success, although the US Navy didn't realize its significance at first. Enright reported sinking a large enemy vessel, but since Shinano's existence was unknown, Navy intelligence assumed it was a smaller carrier. Only after the war did the Allies learn the astonishing truth. Archerfish had sunk the world's biggest carrier. Enright earned the Navy Cross for this feat. Strategically, Shinano's loss underscored the power of undersea warfare and the vulnerability of even the mightiest ships. By late 1944, US submarines were decimating Japan's supply lines, and now they had taken out Japan's new crown jewel. In a broader sense, Shinano's fate symbolized Japan's dire position in late 1944. The era of Japanese naval dominance had ended. Even its grandest projects could be cut down before they had any impact. It's ironic that a relatively small submarine could destroy a supercarrier that took Japan years of effort and vast resources to build. Her legacy embodied ambition versus reality. Conceived as a final trump card for a beleaguered empire, she instead became a testament to the unforgiving nature of war at sea and Imperial Japan's continued downward spiral. As dawn broke on June 5, 1942, the once proud carrier of the Imperial Japanese Navy drifted in flames on the Pacific. The aircraft carrier, Akagi, her decks shattered and burning fiercely, had been the flagship of Japan's carrier fleet only a day before. This climactic moment at Midway marked not only the end of Akagi's journey, but also a turning point in the Pacific War. Explore Akagi's design, service history, and final devastating engagement at Midway that changed the course of the war in the Pacific. Akagi's story began in the wake of World War I, during an era of naval treaties and innovation. She was laid down in 1920 not as an aircraft carrier, but as an Amagi-class battlecruiser intended to wield big guns on a fast hull. However, the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty intervened. Japan was allowed to convert 2 capital ship hulls into carriers, and Akagi was chosen for conversion mid-construction. In an innovative early design, Akagi was completed in 1927 with 3 superimposed flight decks, a unique feature meant to maximize aircraft launch capacity. This multi-level flight deck arrangement, unsurpassed in carrier history, proved impractical as aircraft grew larger and it limited operations. From 1935 to 1938, Akagi underwent a massive reconstruction. Her 3 stubby flight decks were replaced by a single, extended flight deck running nearly the full length of the ship, and a small island superstructure was added to her port side. The rebuilt Akagi emerged as Japan's first large fleet carrier, a floating airfield that would be the pride of the Imperial Navy. In terms of specifications, Akagi was an impressive engineering achievement. After her reconstruction, she stretched 855 feet and displaced about 41,000 tons at full load. Powered by 4 geared steam turbines fed by 19 boilers, she could produce 133,000 shaft horsepower and drive 4 propeller shafts, enough to push the carrier to about 31 knots at top speed. This made Akagi as fast as many destroyers, a crucial attribute for keeping up with a mobile strike fleet. She carried around 66 operational aircraft, plus reserves of 20 to 25 aircraft, typically a mix of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, Aichi D-3A VAL dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. These planes were the sharp edge of Akagi's spear, giving her a formidable striking range. For defense, the carrier bristled with unusual heavy armament for a flat top, initially fitted with 6 8-inch guns in single mounts. By 1941, she had shed many of those 8-inch guns and opted for an array of multiple smaller anti-aircraft guns, including 8 twin 5-inch anti-air mounts and 14 25mm autocannons to fend off enemy aircraft. Her hull was also moderately armoured with a 6-inch belt and 3-inch deck, enough to shrug off small shell hits, but not designed to sustain heavy bombs or torpedoes. With a crew of roughly 1,600 officers and men, Akagi was not just a ship, but a self-contained floating fortress and airbase. Fittingly, she was named after Mount Akagi, meaning Red Castle, symbolizing strength and majesty. In the 1920s and 30s, as naval aviation evolved, Akagi stood at the forefront of that evolution, the first of Japan's new era fleet carriers, and a central component of a bold new strategy that would revolutionize naval warfare. Akagi's early years were spent refining carrier tactics and supporting Japan's invasion of China. By April 1941, Akagi became the flagship of the formidable First Air Fleet, the Kido Butai, under Vice Admiral Nagumo. On December 7, 1941, Akagi led 6 Japanese fleet carriers in the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In the pre-dawn hours, Akagi's decks roared to life as she launched waves of aircraft toward the unsuspecting US Pacific Fleet anchorage in Hawaii. Her complement of bombers and fighters, coordinated with those from other carriers, struck Battleship Row with devastating effect. Akagi's pilots scored direct hits on American warships and airfields. Together with the fleet, they crippled or sank multiple US battleships in a matter of hours. The attack on Pearl Harbor announced the arrival of carrier warfare in dramatic fashion. It also cemented Akagi's reputation. She had served as the command ship for one of the most successful naval offensives in history. After recovering her returning planes, Akagi regrouped with the strike force and steamed home safely. Japan had drawn first blood, and its elite carriers, with Akagi at the forefront, were riding a wave of momentum. In the months that followed, Akagi and the First Air Fleet ranged across the Pacific, enforcing Japan's expanding empire. In January 1942, Akagi's air group supported the invasion of Rabaul in the Bismarck Archipelago, striking Australian bases and helping Japanese troops seize that strategic outpost. By February, the carrier task force moved south and struck Darwin, Australia. Akagi's bombers and strafing fighters took part in a massive raid on Darwin on February 19, 1942, inflicting heavy damage on the harbour and sinking several ships, effectively neutralising the northern Australian port as a threat. As Japanese forces swept through the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, in February and March, Akagi provided air cover and offensive strikes to overwhelm Allied resistance. Her planes hit targets in Java and assisted in the sinking of Allied ships trying to escape Java Sea battles. In the spring of 1942, Akagi and her sister carriers turned west into the Indian Ocean to eliminate the British Eastern Fleet as a potential rival. During late March and early April, in what became known as the Indian Ocean Raid, Akagi's squadrons helped hunt down and destroy Allied naval units. On April 5, 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft caught the British heavy cruisers HMS Dorsetshire and Cornwall at sea south of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and sank them both in short order. A few days later, on April 9th, Akagi's airmen joined in attacking the British carrier HMS Hermes and her escort destroyer, sinking them as well. The Indian Ocean Raid drove the remaining British fleet to retreat to East Africa, leaving the Indian Ocean virtually under Japanese control. These string of victories, from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, showcased the lethality of the Kido Butai. By May 1942, Akagi had proven instrumental in an unbroken chain of Japanese successes across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Neither the United States nor Britain had managed to seriously challenge Japan's carrier force in these early months of the war. Flush with victory, but also seeking to lure out the US fleet for a decisive battle, Japan's naval leadership set their sights on Midway Atoll as the next target. Midway, a remote American-held atoll, was seen as the bait to draw the US Navy's carriers into a trap. Confident from recent triumphs, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the overall Japanese fleet commander, devised a complex plan to invade Midway and ambush any American response. Akagi, still Nagumo's flagship, would once again lead the carrier striking force into battle. In early June 1942, Akagi sailed at the head of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with hundreds of aircraft and a powerful escort of battleships and cruisers. The men aboard Akagi were experienced and battle-hardened. Many likely assumed that this operation would be another overwhelming victory, extending Japan's dominance. They did not know that Allied codebreakers had unraveled the plan and that the US Navy was sailing out to meet them. The stage was set for the fateful Battle of Midway, where Akagi would meet her destiny. Before dawn on June 4, 1942, Akagi and the Japanese carrier force reached their launch point north of Midway Atoll. As the sky lightened, Akagi's crew went to full alert, bracing for a busy morning. At 4:30 a.m., Akagi began launching a strike force of bombers and fighters to attack Midway's airfields. Along with planes from the other carriers, her aircraft swooped over Midway at sunrise, bombing runways and installations in an effort to soften the island's defenses. The initial attack was successful in damaging Midway, but it did not knock the island out. As the first wave returned to the carriers around 7 a.m., the Japanese debated a second strike on Midway. Akagi's flight decks were a frenzy of activity as crews recovered aircraft low on fuel and rearmed those that could be turned around for another potential mission. Amidst these preparations came an alarming report. Around 7:30 a.m., a scout plane from Cruiser Tone signaled that it had spotted an American naval force to the east. Vice Admiral Nagumo aboard Akagi now faced a dilemma. He had some aircraft ready with bombs to hit Midway again, but if enemy ships, possibly carriers, were in the vicinity, they needed to arm torpedo bombers to attack the fleet instead. Caught in indecision, Nagumo initially ordered Akagi and the other carriers to switch armaments for an anti-ship strike. Below decks, ordnance crews rushed to swap out bombs for torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, a laborious process that left Akagi's hangar decks cluttered with munitions and fueled aircraft standing by. The situation grew more tense by 8 a.m. to 9 a.m., as further sighting reports confirmed at least one American carrier in the area. Nagumo, realizing a major sea battle was at hand, cancelled the second Midway strike and focused on readying an attack against the US fleet. During this critical window, Midway-based American aircraft launched several desperate attacks on the Japanese carriers. Waves of US Marine Corps and Army Air Force bombers swept in first, followed by torpedo bombers from Midway, all attempting to hit Akagi's task force. Akagi and her consorts had to take evasive action, twisting at high speed and throwing up intense anti-aircraft fire. Fortunately for the Japanese, these initial attacks from Midway were uncoordinated and largely ineffective. No hits were scored. However, they kept Nagumo's forces occupied and delayed the arming of Akagi's own counterstrike. Just then, new attackers appeared, this time from the US carriers themselves. Around 9:20, American TBD Devastator torpedo planes from the carriers USS Hornet and Enterprise, and soon Yorktown, arrived over Nagumo's fleet, skimming low over the waves. In successive groups, these brave torpedo squadrons pressed home attacks on the Japanese flat tops. Akagi and the other carriers began radical zigzag maneuvers, pushing their throttles to outrun the torpedoes. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, predominantly Zero fighters, dove to sea level and tore into the slow American torpedo planes. One by one, the Devastators were shot down or forced into the water, many never even getting to launch their torpedoes. Not a single torpedo hit Akagi. It seemed to her crew that their aggressive defensive tactics had saved them once again. But in reality, these torpedo attacks had drawn the defending Japanese fighters down to wave-top altitude and scattered them, exactly at the wrong moment. At 10:25 a.m., the real threat materialized high above. Nearly 3 dozen SBD Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise and Yorktown had managed to arrive unseen, taking advantage of the distraction caused by the torpedo attack. They now dove from the sun directly onto the Japanese carriers. Akagi's lookouts barely had time to shout warnings before the sky filled with the scream of diving bombers. On Akagi's bridge, officers looked up to see enemy planes hurtling down at over 250 knots. Akagi was a sitting duck. a trio of Enterprise dive bombers targeted Akagi. Leading the attack was Lieutenant Commander Dick Best, who had spotted Akagi at the last moment and broke off with 2 wingmen to strike the flagship. Best's plane dove almost vertically through the flak, aiming for the center of Akagi's flight deck. He released a 1,000-pound bomb at low altitude, then pulled out sharply. In the tense seconds that followed, Best's bomb tore through Akagi's flight deck near the aft elevator and plunged into the upper hangar deck before detonating in a massive fireball. The explosion was cataclysmic. It ignited stacked aerial torpedoes and bombs and engulfed fueled aircraft in a chain reaction of secondary blasts. Great gouts of flame shot up from the hangar vents and burst through the elevator opening, shredding aircraft and crew within. The flight deck buckled and was instantly ablaze. Simultaneously, another bomb from Best's small group scored a near-direct hit. One bomb, likely dropped by Best's wingman Lieutenant Kroger, exploded just alongside Akagi's midsection. This blast ripped open part of the hull below the waterline and jammed the ship's rudder to one side. A third bomb, from Ensign Weber, landed just off Akagi's stern, close enough to cause further shock damage. In a matter of seconds, these hits devastated the pride of the Imperial Navy. The bridge was not spared. Acrid smoke and flame quickly made Akagi's command center uninhabitable, forcing crew to evacuate. Vice Admiral Nagumo himself, stunned by the sudden calamity, had to abandon his flagship's bridge. By 10:46 a.m., he relinquished command of Akagi and removed his flag, later transferring to a nearby cruiser. Akagi was mortally wounded, but she had not sunk outright. For the next few hours, her crew fought desperately to save their ship. Despite the horrific carnage below decks, damage control teams tried to contain the inferno. They triggered the ship's CO2 firefighting system and flooded sections of the hangar, but the flames fed by aviation fuel were out of control. Within minutes of the bombing, Akagi lost power and began drifting to a stop, with her rudder stuck hard over. The once formidable carrier could now only steam in circles, essentially dead in the water. Thick black smoke engulfed her from bow to stern. By early afternoon, it became evident that Akagi could not be saved. Around 1:30 p.m., with firestorm conditions below deck, the order was given to abandon ship. Akagi's crew reluctantly began to withdraw, taking to lifeboats or jumping into the water to be picked up by escorting destroyers. Captain Taijiro Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, was among the last aboard, overseeing evacuation and refusing to leave until absolutely necessary. The remaining skeleton crew and Captain Aoki finally disembarked late in the day. Throughout the night of June 4th, Akagi continued to burn, a glowing beacon in the darkness. Several destroyers stood by her, shining searchlights on the listing, smouldering hulk. Ammunition sporadically cooked off with dull thuds. Yet, despite the devastation, Akagi refused to sink quickly. Her hull, though fatally wounded, remained stubbornly afloat into the early hours of June 5th. In the pre-dawn hours of June 5th, orders came from Admiral Yamamoto himself, the overall fleet commander who had once been Akagi's captain years before, to scuttle the Akagi. It was a bitter decision. Obedient to the order, the attending destroyers moved into position around the dying carrier. Just after 4 a.m., Japanese destroyers Arashi, Hagikaze, Maikaze, and Nawaki each fired a torpedo into the Akagi's hull. At around 5:20 a.m. on June 5th, 1942, Akagi finally succumbed. She slid bow first under the surface of the Pacific, disappearing into the depths northwest of Midway. Akagi took with her the lives of hundreds of officers and sailors who had been unable to escape the inferno. Yet, remarkably, because there was time to abandon ship, the majority of her crew survived to be rescued. Approximately 267 of Akagi's men perished, a terrible loss, but fewer than those lost on the other carriers that day, due to the delayed sinking and organized evacuation. Akagi's final moments came amid one of history's most consequential naval battles. In the same morning that Akagi was fatally hit, the carriers Kaga and Soryu were also devastated by American dive bombers, and later that day, Hiryu would be sunk as well. The Battle of Midway turned into a catastrophe for Japan's carrier force. For Akagi, the flagship that had led Japan's offensive across the Pacific, it was an especially tragic end, consumed by flames and finished by her own navy's hand. In less than 6 months, Akagi had gone from triumphant attacker at Pearl Harbor to a scorched wreck at Midway. The loss of Akagi, along with the 3 other fleet carriers lost at Midway, marked a profound turning point in the Pacific War. These 4 carriers had formed the core of Japan's offensive striking power. With Akagi and her sister ships gone, Japan's ability to wage fast, long-range carrier warfare was crippled. Equally damaging was the loss of hundreds of seasoned pilots, aircrew, and flight deck personnel who had been the sharp edge of Japan's naval air arm. The Battle of Midway ended the Japanese Navy's string of invincibility and halted their expansion in the Pacific. What had been a bold offensive strategy now shifted as Japan was forced onto the defensive. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the sinking of Akagi was a bitter blow to morale and prestige. Akagi had been the fleet's proud flagship, the highest symbol of Japan's naval might, and the executor of the Pearl Harbor attack. Her destruction, along with the others, shattered the myth of Japanese naval invulnerability. In the months after Midway, Japan struggled to replace the carriers and aircrews it had lost. Meanwhile, the United States, having preserved a portion of its carrier strength, gained the strategic initiative. Soon after Midway, Allied forces launched their first major counteroffensive at Guadalcanal, a campaign made possible, in part, by Japan's weakened carrier force. Midway has often been called the turning point of the Pacific War, and Akagi's fate is emblematic of that shift. The ship that had once led Japan's onslaught now rested on the ocean floor. Japan would never again strike with the same confidence and overwhelming carrier power as it had in early 1942. In contrast, American industrial strength and new Essex-class carriers would soon tip the balance further in the Allies' favour. Though the war raged on for 3 more years, the momentum had irreversibly swung. Akagi's sinking, therefore, was not just the end of one mighty warship, it signalled the beginning of the end. From her ambitious origins as a converted battlecruiser, through her heyday as the spearhead of a relentless carrier task force, to her dramatic destruction at Midway, her story illustrates the ephemeral nature of naval supremacy, how quickly the tides of fortune can turn in war. In the end, the Red Castle of the Japanese fleet burned and sank, taking with it a part of Japan's hopes for victory.